Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. I'm Tom, and today we're going to be talking about books or series I would consider rereading if I did rereads. If you have been around here at the channel for a little while now, you will note that I don't reread and I don't DNF books. Maybe I should do another video on books that I should have DNF'd. That might be a fun one to do. But with the sole exception of being A Christmas Carol at Christmas time, I don't reread books. I don't plan on rereading books, but I saw Brian over at BellTube do this video, and I thought that this was a really good examination of myself and seeing if I did want to dedicate time to rereads, what are some things that would speak out to me and be things that I wanted to re-examine? So what I ended up doing is breaking this down into 4 different categories. I have books or series that I love. I have translated works. I have books I feel like I wasn't ready for. And then the last category is a little bit of a mashup of a bunch of different things. But it is books that I read at the wrong times, should have taken a break with, or I had the wrong expectations for. So those are the categories we're going to go into. I'm not going to dive too deep into any of the books, but I am just going to kind of go through them quickly and talk briefly about maybe what I could experience and if I think if a reread would help my experience or hurt it. So let's go ahead and start with books or series that I love. And first up is my all-time favorite fantasy series of all time, and that is The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. This is an immense series that has 15 books if you're going to count the prequel book as well. And this is a series that I have heard on a reread is an excellent time because there's so much laid out early on, not even just early on, but throughout the series that doesn't get paid off till the very end. And there's going to be things that you pick up on as you go through it multiple times. I'm kind of getting to live the best of both worlds right now because I'm going through this and talking about each book in the series right now with its lit book reviews. And so we're going through and talking about all the books, doing like super deep dive discussions and everything on it. It's been a great time kind of getting to relive that world. But this is definitely one where I think on a reread, I would enjoy it even more than I did the first time, which is hard to say. It's my favorite fantasy series of all time, but I think some of the individual books I would feel even better about if I went back through them. And I'm actually going to talk about one specifically at the end. Next up is the probably newest book on this list, and this is actually one that I read this year, so I didn't really expect that. But as I was going through it, I really do think that if I went back and reread We Used to Live Here by Marcus Kilwer, I would have a fantastic time with it again. I think if I reread it, I might not have as good of a time on the reread as I did the first time because it was such a new experience. This is really kind of like a mystery thriller that turns into like this psychological thing, and I think it's just a really great time. I think knowing how the story ends, and some people don't like the ending, I'm not sure that I would have the same highs as I did the first time, but I do think I would get to examine the story from a very different way, and I think it would be a cool thing to do. Next up, I'm going to talk about Dune. Dune is a book that I really, really enjoyed, but I feel like I didn't get the full scope of what was going on. Also, I would like to continue on with the series, but it's been about 4 years since I read Dune, and part of me is like, I should reread Dune, go straight into Dune Messiah. I think on the reread, this is definitely one that would shoot up the charts a little bit, which is crazy to say because I think it's a top 30 book all time for me. So Dune is definitely another one. And I do also feel like the movies have maybe influenced me a little bit to really want to reread this one. And I just feel like I would get a lot more out of it the first time because there were times, especially with the writing, I did feel myself a little lost with it. And I think experiencing it once would put me into the right mind frame to experience that story again. And then last up is my favorite series of all time. That includes my favorite book of all time. That is The Three-Body Problem, with my favorite book being Death's End. Now, this is a series that I think if I reread it, I wouldn't and enjoy it as much, which is a hard thing to say about your favorite books and series, right? This is definitely one of those ones where I am terrified to reread it because while I think it would worsen the experience for me, I would love to get to experience it again for the first time. This might be one of those ones where I go back and reread it in 30 years. The reason I think that it might be worse on a reread is because this book exposed me to ideas and concepts that I'd never been exposed to before. And I think having been exposed to them, maybe some of the things that impacted me the first time through wouldn't impact me in the same way. And that's definitely something that I do worry about a little bit. The one thing that I would consider rereading this, and this leads us right into the next one of translated work, is if there was a new translation of this book, I maybe would consider it because obviously with translations, things change. I think that is immensely true. And moving on to books I would like to reread because they probably have different translations. The first one is War and Peace. War and Peace is this epic Russian literature book that maybe I shouldn't have read it when I did because I don't know if I was necessarily ready for it, but it is definitely one where I think a different translation, I could maybe connect to it a little bit better. And that is definitely one reason. I've had mixed experiences with Russian literature, but I do think that maybe a different translation could help. I know The Witcher isn't on this list, but I've heard many, many times that the translation from The Witcher from Polish to English is not that great and there's a lot missing there. So maybe the same thing is true with War and Peace, and that if I read a different translation that maybe more people recommended, because I just picked a random one, that it is a story that I would have a better time with. Another one is also The Master and Margarita. This is another Russian book, and I remember reading this and just being absolutely lost. Maybe this is one of those books that is just too metaphysical for me, but once again, translated work, I would love to experience it in a different translation and see if I could connect to it more. And the last one in the translated category is Solaris. This is a sci-fi book that so many people whose opinion I hold very high, Bart from Bart's Book Space, he loves this book. He talks about it, and he had the privilege of, he knows Polish. He is Polish, so he got to read it in the original Polish. And I want to be able to have that experience with some of these books. And so I think if I maybe read a different translation of Solaris, I'd connect with it more. It is another one of those kind of weird metaphysical books a little bit to me, but I do think that, sometimes the translation can definitely do a number on it. Next up, I have 3 books that I think when I read them, I wasn't ready for, and I kind of touched on that a little bit with War and Peace. But first up on my list is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. When I first read Blood Meridian, I didn't know what I was really getting into, and I think it's definitely one that in my literary journey, like I think reading is like a muscle. It's a muscle that you can work and get better at, and I think I read it too early on. I was kind of riding the high of Cormac McCarthy at the time, and I just wanted to, everyone's like, this is his greatest book, right? And so I went into it, and I don't think I was ready for it, and I think, I think people talk about reading this or getting back to this on a reread and experiencing it as a more full story. And so I'm curious on if that is something that would happen, especially now that I have read even more since then. I've read more McCarthy, and I've just read other things that I think have flexed that reading muscle, that has made my brain work in ways that it wasn't before. And maybe I could experience this story a little bit differently. Another one is Moby Dick. Moby Dick, the great American novel, according to some people. This was a book that, once again, I had an okay time with it, but I read this in 2019 when I first got back into reading. And I think there's probably a lot of thematic stuff that just went completely over my head. And I was, thinking this was just going to be a whale hunt story. And I think there's a lot more deeper things that are going on in this book that I just didn't get. And I think a reread would probably really help with that. And then the last one is an absolute classic that so many people love, and that is Pride and Prejudice. I also read this back in 2019 when I was getting back into reading. And I think there was just so much stuff from the time and the culture of what's going on in that story that it just didn't connect with me. And I think going back to it now, being able to really examine some of the thematic stuff that's happening, some of the cultural stuff that's happening, and just being a little bit more exposed to reading literature at that level, I think it would maybe be something that I did a little bit better on. And then moving on to our last category, these are books that I think I read at the wrong time, or I should have taken a break during my reading process, or I just had the wrong expectations going into them. First of all, I have got to say, Lord of the Rings, I think, has got to be on this list. When I read Lord of the Rings, I think I went into it with my arms crossed a little bit. I think I had just heard, and I read this late in life. I didn't read this as growing up. I read, it was either 2020 or 2021 when I read The Lord of the Rings. And I heard so much praise for it and everything. And I think I let that get to me. I think that let me paint my own kind of opinion onto it. And I just didn't let it just be. I didn't let Lord of the Rings just be Lord of the Rings. I guess maybe I was going in expecting so much more, wanting it to live up to something that I don't think it's possible, because the pedestal that some people put the Lord of the Rings on is just astronomical, right? But I do think it is one that if I went back and just enjoyed the story instead of trying to get something out of it, it would be something that I had a much better time with. I have 2 Stephen King books in this list. The first one being It. It is an extremely long book that it deals with some extremely difficult things, right? And I think there were points when I was reading it where I just felt like I needed to push through to finish it, where if I would have just let it sit and settle with some of the heavy things that it's talking about, I would have probably had a better time with it. And it's still a top 50 book all time for me. So it's one of those ones where I think maybe if I was also more used to King in general, if I had read more King, it would be one of those things. But I also was expecting it to be very scary. And it is horrific, but I don't think scary in the way I thought it was going to be is what that book is going for. And so I think it's one of those ones with a couple different things had been changed. It could be an all-timer book for me instead of just an almost all-timer, right? The other example from King is going to be The Shining. I really like The Shining movie. And I even went in trying to not have the same expectations, but I think the story is told from such a different way. I can understand why Stephen King hates The Shining movie, because I think they're 2 completely different things. Even though so much is the same, so much is so different, that I think knowing how different they are now after reading it, that if I went back and read it again, I think I would be able to appreciate the story more. Because I don't think I even really started to appreciate that story until the very end of it. And I think going through it again with knowing exactly what to expect from it because I have read it, it would be a much better experience. And by much better, I mean, once again, this is a book that I really, really liked. I think it was in my top 10 of last year. If not, it was very close. And then the final book I have for this list, and we're going back to The Wheel of Time, and mostly because I just kind of have a funny story for The Great Hunt. The Great Hunt, for a lot of people, is considered one of the better Wheel of Time books. And for me, it is one of my least favorite in the entire series, which is blasphemy in the Wheel of Time fandom for the most part. And I really think the problem is I read most of this book either on a plane to Las Vegas, in Las Vegas, or on the plane ride home from Las Vegas. You can probably see the problem there right away. Not the best situation to try and be reading a large epic fantasy book that's laying out crazy world building already in book two, right? So maybe if I went back and reread The Great Hunt, I would respect it for the book that it is. That is just my one funny story I wanted to throw in here at the end. If you reread books, let me know what books that you really like to reread and why. I'm always curious on what brings people to reread when there's just so much out there. My brain just is not wired that way to go back and conquer the same thing over and over again. But definitely let me know all of that down below in the comments, or definitely hit me up on the Discord. That will all be linked down below in the description. But remember, as always, to read what you want, when you want.